Colonel Marcus Thorne, a man who had spent 3 decades in the shadows of the United States Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, sat in a secure briefing room at Fort Liberty, North Carolina. It was September 2000. Before him lay a topographical map of the Rokel Creek region in Sierra Leone, a landscape that looked less like a geographical location and more like a fever dream of emerald rot and black water. Thorne had seen the meat grinders of the 20th century. He had analyzed the failures of Mogadishu and the complexities of the Balkans. He believed in overwhelming tech overmatch. To him, a hostage rescue in a tropical swamp required a 6-week buildup, a carrier strike group, and a localized blackout of all electronic emissions. But as he read the operational cable from the British Ministry of Defense, he felt a cold, professional dread. The British were planning to launch a full-scale assault on a village called Gberi Bana in less than 48 hours. Their target was a militia known as the West Side Boys, a faction of drug-addicted, erratic and heavily armed guerrillas who had captured 11 members of the Royal Irish Regiment. Thorne turned to his British liaison, a quiet SAS major who sat in the corner of the room cleaning his glasses. "Major," Thorne said, his voice flat with disbelief. "Gberi Bana isn't a village. It's a fortress made of mud and mangroves. You have a single narrow waterway, a jungle canopy that blocks all thermal imaging from our satellites, and an enemy that is literally out of their minds on cocaine and palm wine. You can't stealth your way into a swamp. The moment your birds hit the air, the West Side Boys will start executing hostages. Your manual says this is a high-probability failure mission. Why is Hereford green-lighting this?" The SAS major didn't look up. "General, your manual is built on the assumption that the environment is an obstacle to be bypassed by technology," the major said softly. "In the regiment, we don't bypass the environment. We inhabit it. The West Side Boys think the swamp is their protection. We are going to show them that for the SAS, the swamp is a highway. We aren't going in to negotiate, Colonel. We are going in to excise a tumor. And we're going to do it in 20 minutes. To understand the hardcore reality of Operation Barras, you have to understand the nightmare of Sierra Leone in the year 2000. The country was a fractured skull, a place where the rule of law had been replaced by the rule of the machete. The West Side Boys were the most terrifying manifestation of this collapse. Led by a man who called himself Brigadier 55, they were a militia of former soldiers and kidnapped children, sustained by a constant diet of high-grade narcotics and a belief in their own invincibility. They held the British hostages in Gberi Bana, a collection of huts on the banks of the Rokel Creek. The creek was a labyrinth of silt and crocodiles, flanked by primary jungle so dense that a man could stand 2 meters away from you and be invisible. In the American military mind, this was denied terrain. To the British Special Air Service, this was the home field. The regiment had been preparing for this since the 1950s. Every SAS trooper is a graduate of the Brunei Phase, a month-long immersion in the primary jungles of Borneo, where the thinking soldier is taught to live, navigate, and kill in 100% humidity and near total darkness. They are taught the jungle smell, how to identify a human presence by the scent of wood smoke or cooking oil from 500 meters away. They are taught the jungle walk, a silent toe-to-heel movement that allows a 4-man patrol to move through dry leaves without making a sound. The West Side Boys were confident, Thorne noted, looking at the intelligence intercepts. They had heavy machine guns, they had RPG-7s, they had the high ground of the riverbank. They believed that no Western force would dare enter the Rokel Creek because of the risk of attrition. They were waiting for a diplomatic solution. They were waiting for more money. They were waiting for a ghost, Graham replied. While the diplomats were talking in Freetown, a troop from D Squadron SAS and a team from the Special Boat Service, SBS, were already in the water. They had been inserted by inflatable boats miles downstream and had paddled into the heart of the enemy's territory. They spent 3 days lying in the black mud of the mangroves, less than 80 meters from the hostage huts. They were covered in leeches. Their skin was rotting from the stagnant water, and they were breathing through reeds. They were painting the target with their own eyes, because the satellites couldn't see through the trees. This is the first threshold of the Operation Barras gist. The SAS didn't just plan an assault, they vampirized the enemy's space. They lived in the mud until they knew every sentry's routine, every drug-induced shift in the camp's mood, and the exact position of every heavy weapon. The American Colonel Thorne looked at the assault architecture. It was a vertical envelope. 2 Boeing Chinook HC-2 helicopters, carrying 40 members of the SAS and the Special Boat Service, supported by 100 men from the 1st Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, 1 para. "Chinooks?" Thorne asked. "You're sending the world's loudest helicopters into a jungle clearing that is barely wider than the rotors themselves." The moment they hear those twin rotors, the surprise element is gone. You'll be landing in a kill box of RPG fire. "The Chinook is loud, yes," the major said, "but it is also a psychological hammer." The SAS knew that the West Side boys, despite their drugs, had a primal fear of the British heavy metal. The plan wasn't to sneak in. The plan was to shatter the air. We were going to use the noise as a weapon.
We were going to fly so low and so fast that the overpressure from the rotors would collapse the enemy's huts before the wheels even touched the ground. The date was set, September 10th, 2000. Time, 6:15. The SAS troopers in the staging area at Hastings Airfield were kitted out for high-intensity jungle direct action. They weren't wearing the heavy body armor of the modern era. They were wearing lightweight webbing, jungle greens, and their signature L119A1 carbines with suppressors. They carried flashbangs by the dozen and claymore mines. They knew that in the next 20 minutes, the only thing that would matter was violence of action. The violence of action in the SAS isn't just aggression, Thorne noted in his journal. It is a calculated frenzy. Every man in that Chinook knew exactly which hut he was responsible for. Every man knew the arc of fire of his neighbor. They were a single 40-man organism designed to clear a village in the time it takes to boil a kettle. As the sun began to rise over the Rockall Creek, the 2 Chinooks, call signs Beaver 1 and Beaver 2, took off. They were flying at nape of the earth altitudes, less than 10 feet above the water of the creek. The pilots were using the spray from the river to mask their thermal signature. They were navigating a winding, narrow waterway at 120 knots, their rotor blades missing the mangrove branches by centimeters. Inside Beaver 1, the SAS troopers were silent. There was no "hoo-ah" shouting. There was no nervous chatter. There was only the regimental calm, a state of combat readiness where the heart rate is suppressed and the brain is focused on the intervals. They could feel the heat of the jungle rising through the floorboards. They could smell the rot of the swamp. "We reached the point of no return at 6:14, the major said. The West Side boys were just waking up. They heard a sound like a coming earthquake. They looked up and saw 2 massive, sand-colored monsters bursting through the mist, their rotors churning the river into a white froth. The surprise wasn't that we were there. The surprise was that we were already inside the door before they could reach for their rifles. The first Chinook flared over the village of Gberi Bana. The downdraft was so powerful it tore the corrugated iron roofs off the militia's barracks.
The SAS troopers didn't wait for a fast rope. They helocast, jumping from the hovering aircraft into the waist-deep mud and charging toward the hostage huts. This is the moment where the hardcore reality of Operation Barras begins. The first SAS trooper through the door of the primary hostage hut was met by a West Side boy armed with a sawed-off shotgun. The distance was 3 meters. Colonel Thorne looked at the ballistic report. "One shot?" Thorne asked. "One shot," the major replied. The SAS trooper didn't aim for the chest. He knew the militia were wearing juju charms and thick leather vests they believed were bulletproof. He aimed for the T-box of the skull. He erased the threat in 0.2 seconds and moved to the next room. Behind him, the village was erupting into a kinetic hell. But inside the hut, it was surgical. They had 11 lives to save, and they had exactly 90 seconds to do it before the RPGs started flying. As Part 1 closes, the thinking soldier has entered the jungle's throat. The helicopters are screaming, the mud is flying, and the West Side boys are finally beginning to realize that the ghosts they feared in the swamp have finally come for them. But the meat grinder is only just beginning, and the SAS are about to learn that a drug-crazed enemy doesn't always follow the manual of surrender. Colonel Marcus Thorne stood in the Tactical Operations Center at Hastings Airfield, his eyes fixed on a bank of CRT monitors displaying the grainy, heat-pulsing feeds from a high-altitude Lynx surveillance helicopter. On the screen, the 2 sand-colored Chinooks, Beaver 1 and Beaver 2, looked like massive predatory insects hovering over a sea of obsidian liquid. The time was 6:17, 2 minutes into the assault. "Major," Thorne said, his voice straining against the crackle of 100 radio frequencies. "The thermal bloom on Gberi Bana is off the charts. My analysts are seeing 40 separate muzzle flashes in the first 60 seconds. The West Side boys aren't suppressed, they're reacting. Your men are in waist-deep mud, fighting against an enemy with the high ground and a drug-induced lack of self-preservation. This is the killing zone I warned you about. How is the regiment maintaining the surgical standard in a swamp?" The SAS major didn't look up from the map. He was listening to the acoustic signature of the battle through his headset. "General, the American doctrine of symmetry assumes that a soldier needs a stable firing platform to be effective," the major said. "But the SAS doesn't train for stability. We train for instability. Every man in that mud has spent a month in the Brunei swamps, learning how to treat a liquid environment as a tactical advantage. The mud doesn't just slow you down, it provides organic cover. It hides your heat signature. It dampens the sound of your movement. My men aren't stuck in the mud, Colonel. They are inhabiting it. And as for the West Side boys, they are learning that aggression without discipline is just a fast way to die." To understand the hardcore reality of Operation Barras, you have to understand the divided hammer. The mission wasn't a single strike. It was a simultaneous, twin-axis assault. Axis 1, Gberi Bana. This was the scalpel. 40 members of D Squadron SAS and the Special Boat Service, SBS. Their objective was singular: the 11 British hostages. They had to hit the village with such sudden, overwhelming violence that the West Side boys would be too disoriented to execute the prisoners. Axis 2, Magbeni. This was the hammer. 100 men from the 1st Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, 1 para. Their objective was to neutralize the militia's secondary base across the creek, preventing them from reinforcing Gberi Bana. But as the Chinooks flared over the mud banks, the plan met the friction of the real. Beaver 1, carrying the SAS team, hovered over a cluster of huts. The downdraft from the twin rotors was so immense, nearly 150 knots of vertical wind,
that it created a brownout of pulverized thatch, swamp water, and ancient dust. For 5 seconds, the SAS troopers were blind. The brownout is where most units fail, Thorne noted, reading the after-action telemetry. You lose your spatial awareness, you lose your orientation, but the SAS troopers didn't wait for the dust to settle. They helocasted, jumping 10 feet from the hovering ramp into a slurry of black mud and human waste. They landed in a crouch, their L119A1 carbines already indexed to their eyes. This is the thinking soldier in the mire. As the first SAS trooper, a corporal from the jungle troop named Chris, hit the mud, he was immediately engaged by a West Side boy firing an RPD machine gun from the porch of the brigadier's palace. The 7.62mm rounds were chewing up the water inches from Chris's helmet. In the American Tier 1 playbook, the response to a heavy machine gun is to seek hard cover and call for fire. But in Gberi Bana, there was no hard cover. There was only the mud. Chris didn't retreat. He dived deeper into the swamp, using the black water to mask his silhouette, and began a lateral crawl. He was moving through a cocktail of leeches, stagnant bacteria, and the smell of rot. But he was also counting. He was counting the cyclic rate of the RPD. He knew the weapon had a 100-round drum. He knew the gunner, high on cocaine and adrenaline, was firing in long, undisciplined bursts. He waited for the stutter, the 3-second pause when the gunner has to clear a stovepipe jam or reload. The RPD went silent. Chris erupted from the mud like a ghost. He didn't take a knee. He stood in the waist-deep water, his L119A2 carbine, fitted with an Aimpoint Comp M2 red dot, brought to his eye. He fired a controlled triple. All 3 rounds struck the RPD gunner in the upper thoracic cavity. The 62-grain 5.56mm rounds, optimized for short barrel velocity, punched through the gunner's wooden porch and his chest simultaneously. The L119A1 is a masterpiece of direct action engineering, Graham said, his voice reflecting a dark technical appreciation. It is shorter than the M16, allowing for faster transitional drills in confined spaces, but it maintains the stopping power required for jungle combat. Chris didn't just suppress the gunner, he deleted him, and then he was moving again. He had 90 seconds to reach the hostage hut before Brigadier 5-5 could pull the trigger on the captives. Across the creek, Gberi was becoming a kinetic inferno. 1 para had landed in 3 Chinooks. They weren't using the surgical method of the SAS, they were using industrial attrition. They had brought 105mm light guns and 81mm mortars, which they had staged on the opposite bank. They were creating a curtain of steel between the 2 villages.
The American Colonel Thorne watched the 1 para feeds. "They're using linear suppression?" Thorne asked. "They're literally sawing the jungle in half with machine guns." "They had to," the major replied. "The West Side boys in Gberi had 2 heavy-caliber ZPU-2 anti-aircraft guns mounted on the back of trucks. If those guns had turned toward the SAS Chinooks in Gberi Bana, the mission would have been a massacre. 1 para's job was to be the thunder so the SAS could be the lightning. They were drawing every RPG, every AK-47, and every drug-crazed scream toward them. They were the sacrificial shield." Inside Gberi Bana, the SAS were now at the threshold of the hostage hut. This was the zero-sum moment. 4 men, led by a sergeant from the SBS named Daz, stacked on the mud brick wall of the primary holding building. They could hear the voices inside, the terrified whimpering of the Royal Irish soldiers and the erratic shouting of a guard who was high on brown, a mixture of gunpowder and cocaine. The guard was holding a machete. He was standing over the first hostage, preparing to execute the regimental shame of the British Army. Daz didn't use a flashbang. In a mud brick hut with a thatch roof, a flashbang can cause a flash-over fire that suffocates everyone inside. Instead, he used a mechanical breach. He kicked the door with such force that the rotten wood shattered off its hinges. The guard turned, the machete raised. In the SAS killing house, they train for the ocular window, a 2-centimeter space between the eyes. If you hit that window, the body's motor function ceases instantly. There is no muscle spasm. There is no death squeeze. Daz fired twice. The suppressed muzzle of his carbine produced a dull thud-thud. The guard collapsed vertically, his nervous system disconnected before he could even blink. The machete fell harmlessly into the dirt. The hostages didn't know they were being sieved, Graham whispered.
They saw men in gas masks and jungle greens appearing from the walls. They saw their captors dying in silence. They saw the ghosts of Hereford finally fulfilling the promise that the British Army never leaves its own behind. But the hardcore reality was that Gberi Bana was still a hornet's nest. As the hostages were being moved toward the extraction point, a landing zone, LZ, cleared by the downdraft of the helicopters, the SAS perimeter began to buckle. Brigadier 55, the leader of the West Side Boys, had emerged from his bunker. He wasn't afraid. He was in a state of narcotic euphoria. He was armed with an AK-47 and a belt of grenades. He led 30 of his best fighters in a countercharge against the SAS mud positions. This is where the thinking soldier meets the primal predator. The SAS troopers were outnumbered 4-1 in the mud. They were low on ammunition. Each man carried only 8 magazines. They couldn't use their radios because the heavy jungle canopy and the noise of the battle were creating a signal washout. They had to fight interdependently. Each 4-man team became a tactical island. They weren't waiting for orders from the major. They were executing sector defense based on the vibration of the battle. One trooper, a man named Sully, found himself alone in a trench filled with swamp water. He had 3 West Side boys charging his position with machetes and rusted rifles. He had 1 magazine left. In the American manual, you conserve ammo and wait for support, Thorne noted. Sully didn't wait, Graham said. He transitioned to his secondary, a Sig Sauer P226 pistol. He stood up in the mud, ignored the leeches on his neck and the bullets whizzing past his ears, and he executed a Fijian stand. He engaged the first 2 at 10 meters with the pistol, double taps to the chest. The third man reached the trench. He jumped in with a machete. This was the primal geste. The swamp water was red with blood. Sully didn't use his gun. He used his CQC, close quarters combat training. He grabbed the insurgent's wrist, used the biomechanical leverage of the man's own momentum to break the arm, and then used his Fairbairn Sykes combat knife to end the fight. He didn't celebrate. He didn't even breathe hard. He wiped the mud from his optic and looked for the next target. "That is the regimental standard, General," Graham said, his eyes reflecting the CRT monitors. "A man who can switch from a surgical rifleman to a primal killer in the space of a heartbeat and then switch back to a disciplined professional a second later. You cannot program that. You can only discover it on the Brecon beacons." By 6:45, Gberi Bana was a dead zone for the militia. But the extraction was the final gamble. The hostages were loaded into Beaver 1. The helicopter was hovering with its wheels barely touching the swamp mud. The West Side boys in Gberi, realizing that their prize was escaping, began to fire RPG-7s across the creek. The RPGs were walking toward the Chinook, Thorne said, his heart hammering against his ribs. I saw it on the feed. One rocket missed the tail rotor by less than a meter. If that Chinook goes down in the creek, the mission becomes a Black Hawk Down scenario in the middle of a swamp. The Chinook stayed, Graham said. The pilots, men from the RAF's 7th Squadron, were thinking pilots. They saw the RPG flashes. They didn't retreat. They used the manual flare, dropping the nose of the helicopter to protect the troop bay with the engine block. They stayed until every SAS trooper, every SBS operator, and every hostage was on that ramp. They stayed until the rear gunner told them the mud was clear. As the Chinooks began their maximum power climb out of the jungle canopy, the SAS looked down at the burning remains of Gberi Bana. They had been on the ground for exactly 22 minutes.
But as the thinking soldier knows, a mission is never over until the price is tallied. And as Beaver 1 crossed the coastline of Sierra Leone, the SAS realized that the ghost of Hereford had paid a toll that would haunt the regiment for a generation. Colonel Marcus Thorne sat in the tactical silence of the Hastings Airfield Command Center, his fingers gripping the edge of a mahogany desk. On the primary monitor, the twin silhouettes of the Chinook HC-2s, Beaver 1 and Beaver 2, were banking hard over the Atlantic coastline, their flight paths leaving a white, frothing scar on the grey-blue water. The mission clock read 6:52, exactly 37 minutes since the first rotor blade had sliced through the jungle canopy of Gberi Bana. To the analysts in London and the politicians in Freetown, the mission was already a golden success. 11 British hostages were off the ground. The West Side Boys' command structure had been decapitated. Gberi Bana was a burning ruin. But Thorne, a man who had spent his life monitoring the biometric entropy of special operations, was looking at a different data point. He was looking at the internal communication of Beaver 1. Liaison, Thorne said, his voice dropping into a low, professional growl. Beaver 1 is executing a high-energy landing profile at the Freetown hospital pad. They aren't going back to the staging base. They're skipping the debrief. My SIGINT, Signals Intelligence Team, just intercepted a medical priority burst. They have a man down, a Tier 1 operator. Who is it? The SAS major, his face a calcified mask of Hereford stone, didn't answer immediately. He was staring at a handheld radio, his thumb hovering over the transmit button. The subject is Trooper Bradley Tinian, the major said, the words sounding like they were being carved out of granite. D Squadron, Jungle Troop. He was hit during the extraction buffer at the LZ. He was the last man on the ramp, Colonel. He stayed in the mud to ensure the Royal Irish hostages were shielded from the RPG-7 backblast. He traded his own geometric safety for the lives of the men he was sent to save. To understand the hardcore tragedy of Brad Tinian, you have to understand the final 60 seconds of Operation Barras. The primary hostage hut had been cleared in 90 seconds. The West Side boys were in a state of cognitive collapse. But as the SAS began to funnel the hostages toward the hovering Chinook, the jungle fought back. A group of militia fighters, hidden in a secondary trench line 30 meters from the riverbank, opened fire with a PKM machine gun and 3 AK-47s. It was a baseline ambush. The SAS were exposed on the mudflats. The Chinooks were fixed targets. Brad Tinian, a 28-year-old operator who had survived the most brutal continuation training cycles the regiment could offer, didn't dive for the ramp. He executed a suppress and cover maneuver. He stood in the waist-deep black sludge. His L119A1 carbine braced against his shoulder, and he ate the fire. The 7.62 by 39mm round is a stable flight projectile, Thorne noted, his eyes fixed on the ballistic reconstruction. But when it hits a human body at 20 meters, it doesn't just pass through. It tumbles. Tinian was hit in the lower abdomen, just beneath the ceramic plate of his armor. The round struck the pelvic girdle, shattered the bone into 1,000 secondary fragments, and severed the iliac artery. Inside the Chinook, the air was a chaotic soup of sensory overload. The Royal Irish hostages were screaming, many of them in a state of total psychological shock. The twin Lycoming engines were roaring at 100% torque. The smell of hydraulic fluid, cordite, and tropical rot was suffocating. The SAS medic, a man who had spent 6 months in a Level 4 trauma center in London as part of his regimental sustainment, was already on his knees before Tinian even hit the floor of the troop bay.
"This is the thinking medic under the hardcore pressure of the real," Graham whispered. The Chinook was banking at 45 degrees to avoid RPG fire from Gberi. The cabin was vibrating so violently that you couldn't keep a syringe steady. Tinian was bleeding out at a rate of 1 liter every 60 seconds. His blood was slicking the floor, making it impossible for the medic to maintain a footing. But the medic didn't use a manual tourniquet. He used direct manual pressure, literally sticking his fingers into Tinian's wound to pinch the artery shut while the helicopter was screaming through the air. The American, Colonel Thorne, watched the medical telemetry coming from the Freetown pad. "In the American system, we have the golden hour," Thorne said. "We have the CSAR, Combat Search and Rescue, birds with blood supplies and advanced life support. You have a Chinook cabin with a first aid kit and a man with his fingers in a hole. Why wasn't there a dedicated medevac bird?" "Because in the SAS, every man is the medevac bird," the major replied. "We don't build safety nets, we build self-sufficiency. The regiment knew the risks of Gberi Bana. They knew that in a swamp, a casevac, casualty evacuation, is a logistical nightmare. Brad Tinian knew the risk when he took the rearguard position. He knew that the thinking soldier is responsible for his own survival until the moment he isn't. And then he is the responsibility of the man next to him." The Chinook landed at the Freetown Hospital at 7:05. The SAS troopers, men who had just killed 50 people in 20 minutes, carried Tinian onto the pad. They didn't look like heroes. They were covered in black mud, their eyes were wide with the adrenal fatigue of the kill, and they were desperate. But the hardcore truth of Operation Barras is that the jungle doesn't just kill you with lead, it kills you with entropy. Tinian was rushed into surgery. But the black mud of the Rockall Creek, a mixture of stagnant water, human waste and tropical bacteria, had already been forced into his bloodstream by the pressure of the gunshot wound. He wasn't just fighting trauma, he was fighting sepsis at a systemic level. "He died on the table," Thorne whispered, reading the final line of the report. "He died because he steered," the major corrected him. "In the American manual, Tinian's death is a statistical cost of a high-risk mission. 1 casualty out of a 150-man task force, a 99.4% success rate. But in Hereford, that 0.6% is everything. We don't lose men to statistical cost. We lose them to individual choice. Brad Tinian chose to be the shield, and the regiment has spent 20 years mourning that choice, while celebrating the standard it set." The SAS major turned to the second monitor, which showed the Battle Damage Assessment, BDA, from Gberi Bana and Gberi. "Look at the other side of the ledger, General," the major said. The screen showed the ruins of the villages. The West Side boys were no longer a militia. They were a biology lesson. The 1-para 105mm light guns and the SAS's surgical fire had turned the swamp into a charnel house. "The meat grinder count," Thorne noted. "Confirmed EKIE, enemy killed in action, 56.
Probable, 100 plus. The Brigadier 5-5 was captured, his ego shattered, his drug-crazed army erased in the time it takes to eat breakfast. You didn't just rescue the hostages, you liquidated a threat. We did, the Major said, but the geste of the SAS is that we don't count the enemy's dead. We only count our own. Every man in D Squadron knew Brad. They had walked the long drag with him. They had sat in the killing house with him.
When they flew back to Hastings Airfield that morning, there was no victory drink. There was only the silent debrief. 150 men, covered in mud, staring at the empty seat in the Chinook, where a thinking soldier had been 20 minutes earlier. Thorne looked at the SAS Major. He saw the price of silence in the man's eyes. Operation Barras is taught at Fort Bragg as the perfect rescue, Thorne said. But you're telling me it's the regiment's open wound? It's both, the Major replied. It's the perfect rescue because the individual was willing to be destroyed for the objective. That is the regimental DNA, General. We don't invest in the platform. We invest in the sacrifice. Brad Tinian was the insurance policy that the British Army cashed in to get those 11 men back. And the hardcore truth is that if we had to do it again tomorrow, there would be 40 men fighting for that rear guard position on the ramp. Not because they want to die, but because they are thinking soldiers who know that the many are worth more than the one. But as Beaver 1 and Beaver 2 were being hosed down on the tarmac, the SAS were already looking at the intelligence windfall from Gberi Bana. They had captured the militia's logbooks. They had captured the financiers. And they were about to learn that the West Side boys were just the front end of a much darker, much more high-signature international network that reached all the way back to the heart of London. Colonel Marcus Thorne stood on the sun-bleached tarmac of Lungi International Airport, the humid air of Sierra Leone pressing against his lungs like a damp weight. Beside him, a C-130 Hercules was spooling its engines, preparing to repatriate the body of Trooper Brad Tinian back to the United Kingdom. There were no cameras. There were no politicians. There was only a line of 60 men in jungle greens, standing in a silence so heavy it seemed to dampen the roar of the 4 Allison T-56 turboprops. Thorne had seen the memorialization of American Special Operations, the flags, the honors, the public mourning. But the SAS didn't mourn like other units. They recalibrated. As the ramp of the Hercules closed, Thorne saw the SAS Major turn away from the plane. His eyes weren't red from grief. They were crystalline, focused with a terrifying professional coldness. "Major," Thorne said, his voice low, "the hostages are safe. The Royal Irish are in Freetown. The world thinks Operation Barras is over. My orders are to begin the transition of ISR, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance assets, back to the Mediterranean. But your men aren't packing their Bergen rucksacks. D Squadron is re-zeroing their carbines. What is the second phase of this mission?" The SAS Major didn't look at the plane. He looked toward the dark emerald wall of the Rockall Creek jungle. "General, the American way of war is mission-oriented. You achieve the objective and you leave. The SAS way of war is threat-oriented. We don't just rescue the hostages. We deny the space to the enemy. We leave the environment in a state where the concept of the West Side boys is no longer a viable biological or political reality. Brad Tinian didn't die for a temporary solution. He died to ensure that the Rockall Creek is never used as a bunker for drug-crazed militias again. We are going back into the swamp, Colonel. And this time, we aren't using a scalpel. We are using an
eraser. To understand the hardcore reality of the Wrath of Hereford, you have to understand the SSE, sensitive site exploitation, conducted in the minutes following the hostage extraction. While the Chinooks were lifting off from the mudflats of Gberi Bana, 4 SAS troopers had stayed behind for an additional 6 minutes. They weren't looking for prisoners.
They were harvesting the data. They entered the Brigadier's Palace, the mud brick headquarters of the West Side Boys, and they took everything. They took logbooks written in blood-stained notebooks. They took satellite phones. They took the juju charms and the magic amulets the militia believed made them bulletproof. The intelligence windfall was absolute, Thorne noted in his declassified assessment. The West Side Boys weren't just a random gang. They were a hub for a diamond smuggling network that reached into Liberia and the underworld of Antwerp. They had lists of every village they had raided, every girl they had kidnapped, and every soldier they had corrupted. In those 6 minutes, the SAS acquired the DNA of the insurgency. The second clearing began at 1200 on September 10, 2000. The SAS didn't use the Chinooks this time. They didn't want the noise. They used assault kayaks and inflatable Gemini boats with muffled engines. They moved in 4-man snicks, sliding through the black water of the mangroves like predatory shadows. This is the thinking soldier in the post-kinetic environment. The West Side Boys who had survived the initial assault had fled into the primary deep, the parts of the swamp where even the local fishermen feared to go. They believed the white ghosts would be afraid of the crocodiles, the leeches, and the spirits of the swamp. They were wrong. The SAS Jungle Troop had been training for exactly this in the Temburong district of Brunei. They knew how to live in the anoxic zone of a swamp, where the oxygen is thin and the rot is thick. They moved without talking. They moved without signature. They were tracking the survivors by the visual cues that a drug-crazed gorilla leaves behind. A broken branch, the smell of cheap marijuana, the distinctive drag mark of a rusted AK-47. The tracking in the SAS is a bio-digital hybrid, Graham explained. We use thermal sensors, yes. But the primary sensor is the human eye, attached to a brain that has been trained to see anomalies in the jungle's geometry. One trooper, a man named Geordie, found a group of 12 West Side Boys hiding in a hollow log formation deep in the mangroves. They had been there for 6 hours, motionless, waiting for the ghosts to leave. Geordie didn't call for an airstrike. He didn't use a grenade. He moved to within 5 meters of the log. He was so close he could hear the ragged, terrified breathing of the militia fighters. He was so close he could smell the brown, cocaine and gunpowder, sweating out of their skin. He keyed his radio with a click code, 2 pulses of static. The 4-man SAS team erupted from the water simultaneously. It wasn't a firefight, it was an execution of doctrine. They didn't fire in bursts. They used surgical single shots. 12 targets, 12 rounds. All 12 hits were zero-function strikes to the cranium. The West Side Boys died believing their magic had failed them, Thorne whispered. But it wasn't magic, it was repetition. Geordie and his team had fired 50,000 rounds in the killing house over the previous year. To them, shooting a man in a swamp was as mechanical as breathing. They were depersonalizing the violence. They were just clearing the registry. But the hardcore reality of Phase 2 was the psychological demolition. The SAS realized that the power of the West Side Boys was built on fear and mythology. To kill the militia, you had to kill the legend. The SAS took the captured leaders, including Brigadier 5-5, and they did something that the American manual doesn't include in its ROE, Rules of Engagement. They unmasked the magic. They took the bulletproof vests and the spirit protectors of the militia, and they staged a ballistic demonstration in front of the captured survivors and the local villagers who had been terrorized for years. They showed them that a British 5.56mm round didn't care about juju. They showed them that the gods of the swamp were just men in dirty clothes who bled red when the ghosts came. This is the information operation, IO, at its most primal, Thorne noted. The SAS weren't just killing the enemy, they were invalidating their entire world view. They were shattering the ego of the insurgency. By the time the SAS were done, the villagers were no longer afraid of the West Side boys. They were afraid of the men in the jungle greens, who had erased the monsters in 20 minutes. Across the region, the wrath of Hereford continued for 72 hours. One para held the cordon, preventing any reinforcements from reaching the creek, while the SAS snaked through the terrain, systematically harvesting every last node of the militia's network. They found the arms caches, buried under the roots of ancient kapok trees. They found the diamond pits, where the militia had forced children to dig for the wealth that funded their drugs. They dynamited everything. They turned the sanctuaries of the West Side boys into craters. The environmental erasure was total, the major said, his voice flat. When D Squadron finally extracted from the Rockall Creek on September 13th, there was nothing left of Gberi Bana but the smell of ash and the silence of a graveyard. We didn't just win the battle, General. We exorcised the location. We made the cost of capturing a British soldier so high, so hardcore in its retribution, that no militia in West Africa would ever dare to touch the British Jack again. But as the SAS were hosing the black mud off their boots for the last time, a message arrived from London. It was a top-secret flash from the Director of Special Forces, DSF. Thorne watched the SAS major read the message. He saw the man's jaw tighten. "What is it, Major?" Thorne asked.
Is there another cell?
"No," the major said, handing the message to Thorne. "It's about the hostages, the Royal Irish Regiment, the men we just saved. The DSF has ordered a classified inquiry into how they were captured in the first place. The thinking soldier has done his job in the swamp. Now the regimental inquisitors are going to find out why the Standard was allowed to fail." Thorne looked at the message. He realized that the wrath of Hereford didn't just point outward at the enemy. It pointed inward, at the weakness within its own ranks. The SAS had saved the soldiers, but they were about to destroy the reputations of the men who had allowed themselves to be taken. The Nairobi anomaly had its hero in Christian Craighead. Operation Storm had its legend in Laba Laba, but Operation Barras had its shadow. A realization that for the SAS, the only thing more dangerous than a drug-crazed guerrilla in a swamp is a professional failure that costs the life of a trooper. The air in London in the autumn of 2000 was crisp, a sharp, cold contrast to the suffocating humid rot of the Rockall Creek. But inside the oak-panelled offices of the Ministry of Defence in Whitehall, the atmosphere was as heavy as the Sierra Leonean mud. Colonel Marcus Thorne sat in a high-backed leather chair, a glass of water untouched on the table before him. Across from him, the SAS Major, the man who had orchestrated the acoustic inferno of Operation Barras from a radio room, was closing a leather-bound folder. Thorne had seen the victory parades of the American military, the ticker tape, the televised speeches, the mission accomplished banners. But in London, there was only a classified debrief. The British press was hailing the rescue of the 11 Royal Irish soldiers as the Great Escape.
a heroic triumph of British steel over African chaos. But Thorne, a man who had spent his life analyzing the internal entropy of elite units, knew better.
He knew that for the Special Air Service, Operation Barras was not a triumph. It was a corrective action.
"Major," Thorne said, his voice echoing in the quiet room, "the public thinks this was a miracle. They think the ghosts of Hereford saved the day. But I've read the internal sensitive site reports. I've seen the post-action inquiry into the Royal Irish Regiment. You didn't just rescue those men, did you? You recovered them from a situation that should never have existed. And now the regiment is looking for blood, not from the West Side boys, but from the soldiers who allowed themselves to be captured." The SAS major leaned back, his eyes reflecting the grey London sky through the window. "The hard-core truth of the SAS, General, is that we do not exist to solve tactical problems. We exist to solve professional failures." The Royal Irish Patrol, led by a major who ignored every warning about the Rockall Creek, violated the first commandment of the thinking soldier: never underestimate the environment. They drove into a red zone without a secondary communications link, without a heavy weaponry escort, and without an extraction plan. They allowed themselves to be disarmed by a group of drug-crazed teenagers. In the eyes of the regiment, that isn't a misfortune. It is a betrayal of the standard. To understand the hardcore legacy of Operation Barras, you have to look at the purge that followed. Within 6 months of the rescue, the majority of the Royal Irish soldiers who had been captured were encouraged to leave the British Army. The regiment's disdain for being taken prisoner, for being the hostage, is structural. In the SAS, a soldier's primary duty is to never become the burden. By allowing themselves to be captured, the Royal Irish had forced 40 SAS troopers to risk their lives in a swamp. They had cost the life of Brad Tinian. The wrath of Hereford didn't stop at the jungle's edge, Thorne noted in his journal.
It reached into the very heart of the British military hierarchy. The SAS made it clear: if the regiment has to bleed to save you from your own incompetence, your career is a casualty of the mission. It was a brutal, thinking soldier assessment. They weren't heroes to the SAS. They were liabilities that had been liquidated at a very high price. But the hardcore reality of the price was the clock tower in Hereford. Trooper Brad Tinian's name was carved into the stone of the SAS memorial. He was 28 years old. He had a pregnant partner. He was a master operator of the jungle. And in the secret, internal councils of the Ministry of Defence, his death was the pivot point for a new era of British foreign policy. Operation Barras was the proof of concept, Graham explained. It showed the British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, that the SAS was not just a special forces unit, it was a strategic scalpel. It showed that a force of 60 men could do what a conventional brigade of 5,000 could not. They could decapitate an insurgency, rescue a national reputation, and deny a territory to the enemy in under 20 minutes. Barras turned the SAS from a tactical asset into a political instrument. From that moment on, Hereford was no longer the backup plan. It was the primary weapon. The American Colonel Thorne looked at the geopolitical BDA, Battle Damage Assessment, of Sierra Leone. The West Side boys didn't just disappear, Thorne noted. They were biologically erased. Within a year of Operation Barras, the Revolutionary United Front, RUF, the parent organization of the militia, began to collapse. The legend of the ghosts had spread through the jungle like a virus. Every guerrilla in West Africa knew that if you touched a British soldier, the sky would fall on your head in 20 minutes. You created a deterrence of fear that lasted for a decade.
This is the hardcore application of maximum retribution, Graham said.
We didn't just win the battle, we conditioned the environment. We made the cost of hostile action so high that the physics of the insurgency became unsustainable. That is the thinking soldier's contribution to grand strategy. He doesn't just kill the enemy, he invalidates the enemy's will to exist. But as the thinking soldier knows, every perfect mission leaves a shadow. The SAS major opened a final, thin file in the folder. It contained a series of medical sustainment reports for the members of D Squadron who had fought in the Gberi Bana mud. The price of the swamp wasn't just lead, the major whispered. It was biological entropy. Every man who jumped into that black sludge in 2000 carried the signature of the Rockall Creek back to England. We had men with jungle rot that wouldn't heal for 2 years. We had men with parasitic infections that baffled the London School of Tropical Medicine. The swamp followed them into the killing house. It followed them into the bars of Hereford. It was a hardcore reminder that the jungle always takes a piece of you. Thorne stood up and walked to the window of the Whitehall office. He looked at the tourists walking past the gates, unaware that the men who protected them were ghosts who lived in a state of permanent adrenal fatigue. I came here to understand the tactics of Gberi Bana, Thorne said. I wanted to know how to optimize our MH-60 Little Birds and our fast roping techniques. But I realized that the tactics were the least important part of Operation Barras. The important part was the individual attrition. It was the fact that Brad Tinian decided to be the shield on the ramp. It was the fact that a thinking soldier like Geordie decided to hunt 12 men in a log with a single-shot carbine. "And what did you learn, General?" Graham asked. "I learned that the American system is built on probability," Thorne replied. "We build probability models that tell us we have an 85% chance of success if we use these sensors and those platforms. But the SAS, you build possibility models. You find the man who, when the probability is 0%, makes the mission possible through pure, hardcore will. You don't train Barras, you select for it. You find the man who can stand in a swamp for 3 days, breathing through a reed, and still fire a T-box shot in 0.2 seconds. And that, Brigadier, is why you don't need a billion-dollar drone. You have the man in the mud." The Nairobi anomaly had its hero in Christian Craighead. Operation Storm had its legend in Laba Laba. And Operation Barras has its standard. The realization that in the 21st century, as in 1941, the ultimate force multiplier is the human soul, selected for the extreme, trained for the impossible, and hardened until it can do what no machine will ever do. It can go through the door. It can clear the room, and it can come back alone. As the sun set over the Ministry of Defense, the SAS major picked up the folder. He didn't look back at Thorne. He walked out of the room, heading back to Hereford, back to the clock tower, and back to the next thinking soldier who was currently crawling through the rain of the Brecon beacons, wondering if he was enough to stand on the ramp of a Chinook in a burning swamp. The story of Operation Barras is the jungle standard of the regiment because it is the purest demonstration of the regimental DNA. It is a story of violence, stealth, and retribution. It is a story of 11 men who were saved, and 1 man who died so that the standard would never be lowered. And as the screen fades to black, the image of the Rockall Creek remains, a dark emerald labyrinth where the ghosts of Hereford once proved that even in the heart of the green hell, there is no sanctuary from the wrath of the regiment. That is the system. That is the legacy. That is the Special Air Service. Who dares wins.